Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in this morning on what is a rather cold and wet and wintry Melbourne morning. We really appreciate it. Really exciting event today in cybersecurity with a focus on the future cybersecurity threats and challenges. It's my honour to welcome you here. My name is Will Calvin. I'm the Director of Technology and Enablement for RMIT Online. Firstly, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct our business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present. Given that much of the work we do at RMIT, particularly at RMIT Online, is across Australia, both physically and also in the cyberspace that we're talking about today, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across all the states and territories where we conduct our business. So welcome again. Thank you very much for coming. We're going to talk today about a topic that's very close to my heart as a technologist. I've been working in this area for 20 years, and I've been very lucky, I guess, to work across a broad range of different roles, both technical and non-technical, and I think one of the common threads across all of those roles has been a focus, an ever-growing focus on cybersecurity. It's great to see so many people here today from diverse roles. I was looking at the name cards coming in, and from both technical and other roles, and I think it shows just how wide the impact of cyber is now. And it's not just the responsibility of CIOs and the IT guys, as I'm sure you've been hearing for a number of years, and it hasn't been for some time. In addition, it's becoming more and more important in our private lives, both with our personal security and with the security of our data. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it in recent times. But for those of us with children, I guess a new front has opened up around children's e-safety and cyber safety as well. I don't think there's ever been an area of our work which has permeated into our private lives with such consequences as cyber safety and the topics we're talking about today. Interestingly, Australia ranks 7th in the most committed cybersecurity country index, according to the International Telecommunication Union's 2017 Global Cybersecurity Index. That's a mouthful. So 7th. We'd prefer to be in the top 5, I think. Whilst it isn't bad, it could be better. And I think the biggest challenge we face to maintain that position and perhaps to move up is a pretty critical skill shortage in Australia at the moment. AusCyber is predicting the need for an incredible 20,000 jobs in the next 5 years. Interestingly, in alignment with that, there's an article in yesterday's AFR, some of you may have seen it, talking about the roles and skills that are bucking the wage growth stagnation in Australia at the moment. And we're seeing a trend, particularly in cybersecurity roles, with wage growth of around 15%. So not only is there significant demand for these roles, but we're seeing employers willing to pay handsomely, given the critical importance and compulsory skill sets of these future of work. To help address this skills gap, RMIT Online recently partnered with Palo Alto Networks and NAB to launch a 6-week short course, Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy. This course is also included in our newly announced graduate certificate in Emerging Technologies and Law to ensure legal professionals are staying up to date with the critical challenges of Industry 4.0. Enough from me. We're delighted to host today's esteemed panel of experts. I'm looking forward to hearing from them. It's with great pleasure I introduce our facilitator for today, the Australian's technology reporter and former RMIT graduate as well, which is fantastic, David Swan. David covers the fast-growing technology ecosystem and how it's changing the way we work, live and play. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thanks very much, Will, and I do drink considerably less beer these days than I did back at RMIT. Just clearing that up, making sure that you're aware of that. And I did not see the story in the AFR, but I've heard it's a decent newspaper, even though I've never read it. Never read it myself, but I've heard it goes okay. Cybersecurity, very close to my heart as well. A, because it's given me countless stories to write and keeps me busy as a journalist. But secondly, because I did have my identity stolen once upon a time, and it was a real pest to get that sorted. So on a personal and professional level, cybersecurity is an incredibly important topic, and one I'm really going to enjoy sinking my teeth into today with our lovely panelists. But yeah, without further ado, I'd love to welcome my panelists up onto the stage. We've got Daniel, Louisa, and Helaine. So yeah, love to start if you would like to briefly introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about what you do professionally and a little bit about how it relates to cyber.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Good, thank you. My name is Daniel Muchow. I am the head of cybersecurity at a management consulting firm called RiskLogic. I've been in the cybersecurity game for about 10 or 15 years now, in a relatively new role at RiskLogic, and my practice is at the response end of cybersecurity. So I get the fun task of going out and talking to a lot of people and companies about their cybersecurity response, a response to an incident, and how they prepare for that. So that's a little bit about me. Look, it's a fantastic field to work in. There is certainly a lot happening in the cyber field, and there's a lot for us to unpack this morning. So that's probably enough about me.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Louisa Vogelenzang. At the moment, I am producing and co-hosting a cybersecurity podcast here in Melbourne called Cybersecurity Café. I'm also volunteering at ID Care, who are Australia and New Zealand's national support service for cyber and identity crime. And been in cybersecurity for 15 years. I absolutely love this field. It's my passion and it doesn't feel like work, so really happy to be discussing it today.
Hello, I'm Helaine. I head the cyber law practice for a firm called Sladen Legal. I've been in this field for about 20 years, starting in an industry that was similar to what PEXA is doing here now. But I think the view that I have about these things is slightly interesting, hopefully interesting, because it's a broader cross-section than most people have, because I'm a lawyer, I'm a security professional, and I'm a privacy professional, and I've worked in information governance for a long time. So I have, hopefully, a story to weave where it all comes together, because I think that's really where we are today, is we have this need for a multidisciplinary response to what's happening.
Let's dig into it. I mean, what do you rate in terms of 2019 and the current state of play when it comes to cybersecurity, both Australia and I guess more globally as well? And whoever wants to just jump in and start chatting.
Yeah, well, yeah, I might kick off and just see how we go. Look, one of the things I've been keeping an eye on, David, and I think this is the first year where I've started to see, well, first couple of years actually, where I've started to see a real kinetic effect from the nation-state conflicts that we've been seeing around the world. So, you know, you're seeing these manifestations of things like the China-US trade wars. You're seeing things happening in the Iran Gulf, and what you're seeing then is a translation into the cyber realm and a bleeding, I guess, of those nation-state conflicts from things that were happening at a kinetic state versus state level up here. And it's coming down now, it's bleeding down into industries and into economies. So I think that's been a really interesting trend. And I made a few predictions at the start of the year to my colleagues, and one of them was that you'll increasingly see individuals and businesses targeted as part of that broader nation-state dynamic. And I think that's starting to play out quite a lot now.
Yeah, I think maybe to add, because I love stats, so I'm going to share some of those. So I think conservative estimates are that cybercrime's costing Australia $1 billion a year to our bottom line, and that's pretty conservative. That's direct costs. And there was some Telstra research earlier this year that came out that said 65% of businesses have been interrupted by a breach this year. Last year, so that's the 2018 figures, and that was up 5%. So we can see that trajectory going up as well. And then I could speak, I guess, from an ID Care perspective, from a consumer perspective. We handled 3,000 cases last month. So those are all individuals that have been impacted by their credentials being harvested in some way, either through a data breach or some other event. and they've had real impacts, either financial or psychological. And we could double the size of our counselling team that we have of ID Care, and we still wouldn't get through all the cases. So that's kind of a bit of a state of play from my perspective. Just to go back to what Daniel said, I've worked in information warfare for about 15 years. When I came to Australia in 2012 as a security professional on a 457 visa, and then started my own business a few months later, 10 months later, I put on my website helicopters, and I started offering services in warfare and espionage. And Australians laughed at me. That was 2012. This is the most innocent Donald Hall country you can imagine. Only in 2015 did the federal government begin to wake up to what was actually happening. Only in 2016 did we see the Defence White Paper and the Cybersecurity Strategy. Only then. Australia is, in my view, at the heart, geopolitically, geographically, positioned to stabilize what is otherwise a very unstable world. We have the right moral values, we have the right history and connections to the US, the UK, and we belong in Asia. We're Australasian. And we need to find a way, and we can find a way. What I see is the federal government pumping out legislation in anything that's connected to data, this avaricious collection of data for mining, without the ability to protect it properly. What I see is the call for government and the private sector and academia to work together going out very strongly, but it isn't yet happening. There are pockets of it happening that we see through the JSOCs and some initiatives, but essentially we're in trouble. We have the capacity, and I think that here DFAT is doing it well, although I've had some arguments with them about their approach, because I think model laws and conventions are a good way to approach what needs to be done. And they say, no, we don't need new laws, we need to work with what we have. If that's the case, then we need interpretation, we need the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary to come to the party to say, how are we going to work with what we have? Let's have guidance. But we have, and we need to take a leadership position, because the rest of the world is actually withdrawing from cooperation. South African International Court of Justice, we've got Brexit, everybody's withdrawing. And Australia is positioned, so I would say to leaders here, come to the party, pull together, and let's work with what we have.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Helaine. And do you want to elaborate a little bit in terms of how we make that shift from talking the talk to walking the walk and getting some actual, outcomes here? I mean, as a journalist, I hear a lot of people saying the right things, obviously, but then it's a total another thing to actually do what's required. What do you think that might look like if we are going to take more of a leadership position?
I've got strong views. I think, and a lot of the international work that I do, my talks and the papers that I publish talk about these sort of things. So there are many excuses. People saying, you've got all these different rules, different jurisdictions, there's no cooperation. That's nonsense. If you look at what is the laws that we have across most of the world, even sometimes China and Russia, are the same. You're talking about international public law where there is a lot of commonality. And that should be the lowest bar. All we need is to use that. There are models where people through the law of contract and trade and industry have simply agreed on how to do things, what constitutes acceptable behavior in cyberspace. And it exists in other laws. Whether you look at self-defense models, whether you look at, it's simply a case of reinterpreting what is there already. Part of what I think is that ASIO, for example, in the ASIO Act, there is provision for somebody to be appointed as an ASIO affiliate. Now, for years, we've had Telstra more empowered on somebody else's network than the owner of the network itself. Now, if you look at what's necessary here, we could easily appoint affiliates to do specific jobs with limitations and with checks and balances that would help people. So it's about translating how do you get the private sector involved and how do you get academia, and I think I'll make a point of that because there are many of you here, is the heart of it all. The researchers and what's happening at the front line is what we need to feed down. And we are beginning to see far more interaction. So well done on that.
I think it's also no great surprise to me that you saw in the last couple of weeks Mike Burgess, who was the Director General of the Australian Signals Directorate, now being appointed as the Director General of Security or the head of ASIO. And that's a very deliberate public message, I think, by the government to say very much now that, and I completely agree, they've dropped the ball over the last decade on this threat, but now they're saying, first and foremost, the greatest threat to Australia's national security is in cyberspace, and they've appointed Mike Burgess, a man who's probably one of the most capable people within the Australian government to spear-charge our response to that threat. And I think it's an acknowledgement as well that he needs powers outside what traditionally an intelligence agency like the Australian Signals Directorate can do because of the way the cyber threat's evolving and growing and the actors who are in this space, and that he needs the powers of an ASIO and a broader intelligence community for us to step up and to play that pivotal role, as you were saying, Helaine.
And shifting the lens a little bit to corporate Australia, what do you think in terms of our capabilities there? I know I've been reporting on some businesses, for example, a listed one I'm thinking of in particular, where the whole organisation's almost just crumbled after multiple attacks, and they didn't have the resilience there. What do you think in terms of how our companies sit in terms of their preparedness today versus where maybe they should be sitting?
Oh, look, it's a mixed bag, and definitely in my practice, David, I see the whole spectrum from tier one banks right down to medium-sized businesses, and some people prepare themselves really well for cyber events, and I mean that across the spectrum, so not just good cyber hygiene with their people, but also preparing for when an event does go wrong. That's not a matter of if in the cyber realm, it's definitely a matter of when for most companies, but it's definitely a mixed bag. I mean, you look at the business environment, I guess, the broader macro considerations that are at play. There's a lot on the modern plate of an Australian business, and cybersecurity and cyber protection and information is definitely there, but there's a lot that's competing for attention, there's a lot that's competing for valuable resources, and there's I guess, a difficult balance to get right for many companies. I think a lot of them overlook some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the easy things that companies can do, and they can focus on things like good cyber hygiene practices with their people, and also, understanding what their information looks like, understanding where their information assets are, and some of the basic things about getting a footprint of what their network looks like isn't done well. In some industries, it's done well, so I think the financial services sector in Australia plays pretty good. There's a lot of increasing regulation. That's a whole other stream we could maybe touch on in that field. But you'll start to see that regulatory effect bleed through and move through to other businesses. But the short answer to your question is it's a mixed bag, and I think will continue to be a mixed bag.
Yeah, I was going to maybe ask the audience a question. Who here has a cybersecurity team or somebody dedicated to cybersecurity within their business? So there was a survey done in Australia, so these are 2018 numbers, about 1,800 businesses surveyed, and only a third of them had a cybersecurity team. So I think one of the challenges is for Australian businesses that, they don't have a dedicated team kind of helping them on a day-to-day basis. But I also wanted to introduce, and if there's any psychologists in the room, or you may have heard of a human condition called optimism bias. So it's something. Yeah, there's a few laughs there. I think some people will be very familiar with that. As humans, we don't think the bad thing is going to happen to us. That's essentially what that's about. And I think that plays into the business world as well. But on the flip side, businesses are very used to managing risk. So I think we just haven't made enough of that link back to cyber being a business risk. So, yeah, I think just that's my viewpoint on that.
I agree. I think part of it is that people don't actually know what cyber is. And I don't mean to be rude, but it's a real point, even in the security community where I work. So you'll see up there I'm involved in the Australian Information Security Association. We have a very big community going on for 5,000 people now. And there is ongoing discussion as what is cyber, what is IT, what is the difference, how does it all fit in. I see John O'Driscoll's here, and I'm fascinated because in Victoria, when you announced your cybersecurity strategy a while ago, that was a successor to the IT security strategy. So Victoria took this approach of one and then the other. Just a lot of understanding. And the truth of it is that most people are trying to make the widgets that they make money out of. Yes. So this whole thing, it's a problem. Well, from a legal point of view, it's quite interesting because, again, through ACE and other channels being involved here, we are looking to raise the bar for the legal profession because that's one of the most highly targeted areas and one of the most neglectful. Yeah, they will have tens of attacks on law firms during a single day. And they're not paying attention. They've got IT people, but they don't have security people. They're trying to do what lawyers do, and some lawyers here think you don't need to be a good tech lawyer. I mean, to be a good tech lawyer, you don't need to understand technology, and you actually do. You need to understand what the information is, where it flows, who shares it, etc., what the value of it is. So it's, again, the need for the multidisciplinary thing, and as to risk and status, it's just a question of, are you a startup, are you a mature business, what sort of cycle are you going through, what's the industry sector?
Yeah, and just to touch on that point, I think is really important. The legal profession absolutely is a target, but something that I'm increasingly seeing and increasingly concerned about is the health profession. So what you're seeing there is a real drive towards digitisation in the health sector and the health economy. And those guys have a rightful focus, I think, on patient care and patient safety, and that's where they look. But there's a lot happening. There's a lot of data, a lot of information. I mean, who here has a health e-record? Who knows if they have a national health e-record? Yeah? Hands up? Yeah. Do you know that insurers are looking into the health e-records and they're seeing what tests are being done and what you're doing? I mean, there's so much to unpack in the health world outside of some of the sexy elements like hacking a pacemaker or an insulin pump or something like that. It's the volume of information and the push in that industry towards digitisation, I think that's going to create nearly a perfect storm when it comes to cybersecurity issues.
And if I could just add one more thing on the challenge that businesses face today. It's Scams Awareness Week here in Australia. And, you know, the message they're pushing is that, you know, you think you're too smart to be scammed. Well, you know, and then they demonstrate that actually anybody can be scammed. And why we should care about scams in the corporate world is that, you know, we're talking about a phishing email. That is a scam. So, and that is one of the biggest threats to businesses at the moment is threats delivered via email. So I'm going to make an admission, which, you know, some people look at me like I'm crazy. I work in cybersecurity, but I have opened a phishing email. It was deeply embarrassing, and you get that, you know, extra embarrassment being in cybersecurity, but it can happen to anyone. And that's something that businesses must recognise, is that anybody can fall victim to a scam. They can click on a link, and so the human challenge in cybersecurity is, in my opinion, the most significant.
If it helps at all, I mean, I tell everyone that they should use different passwords for everything, but I use the same password for everything myself, so I don't follow my own advice. I shouldn't have told everybody that.
Is it password 123?
Yeah, we're not going to go into that. Speak to me later. Maybe, yeah, no, I'm not going to tell anyone my password. Let's talk about boards, and if they want to be having this conversation, what sorts of things should they be doing? Should the CEO be directly involved? Is that necessary? Should they be establishing a cybersecurity team, for example? What if a board is to get this right? What might that look like?
I want to jump on that.
Yeah, please do.
Because I love CPS 234. So we've got APRA. We talk about boards. It's a great example, and it's the very Australian way. You know, you've got all this high-powered, you know, the primary legislation, secondary legislation, and you get all the regulators that step in and that provide all this detail, which is completely unnecessary because it all exists up there anyway. But Australians like detail. Now, you have to do this. So you, the board, are responsible for cybersecurity. You, the board, can go to jail if you don't do things properly. It's serious stuff. People are paying attention. There are whole projects in big institutions that are rolling this out with millions of dollars behind it. The little guys will follow. I think, Dan, you made a point earlier that it filters through, right? That will definitely happen. But yes, the board is responsible whether you've got CPS 234 or not, because the Corporations Act says you are.
I think there's a real, I mean, I speak to a number of boards in a number of different industries about understanding cybersecurity risk. So I think someone mentioned earlier, boards are really good at understanding business risk. I think it was you, Louisa, and they know how to operate with business risk, but they haven't quite yet translated that into a cyber risk appetite, and they don't really have the reference or the terminology or the knowledge to interpret what they're being told by their people, if they have cybersecurity people, and what that means for them as a board. So I think there's an education process for a lot of boards out there at the moment, and that's something that's occupying quite a bit of my time, is talking to different boards about just how can you apply an appropriate lens to all this information and then make decisions, because you are responsible now under CPS 234, and that will permeate to other industries, because that applies to people who provide third-party services to the financial services industry, and that's basically nearly every company in Australia. So I think there's a lot of work for boards to do there about understanding how to translate all this information and all this noise in cybersecurity into an appropriate risk appetite for their business.
Yeah, maybe I can add, I recently did the AICD's Cyber for Directors course. It's a really fascinating course, which I highly recommend. And it was so good for someone who's been in cybersecurity for 15 years to kind of take that step back and see how cyber was viewed by the board. And a couple of key takeaways from that, the messaging that they were sort of sharing with boards was, this is a business risk, and you probably want to integrate cyber into your overall risk framework. So that was one of the messages. And the other one, which will be quite interesting for the technologists in the room, was that they advised boards to go out and talk to people on the shop floor, find out whether there's anything in cybersecurity that's stopping them doing their jobs efficiently, whether it's getting in the way, it's blocking them. And they were encouraging the boards to go and ask those questions, because they said if you have those blockages or technologies that are too overbearing or policies that don't work for people, they're going to go around them, and you've got a challenge there. So I thought that was quite an interesting perspective.
We've got mandatory breach notification reporting now. The regulation is there, meaning that you do obviously have to disclose if you are aware of a breach. Talking about that, but also more broadly, do you think regulation is where it needs to be? Any strong opinions on are more laws or regulations required to ensure that best practice is followed?
I want to say no, and this is the lawyer talking. We don't need new law. We need to do what we know is right. And that really is what's happening behind the outcome of the Royal Commission and the Helaine report and so on is really, and the AICD corporate governance thing as well, it's not can you do it, it's should you do it. And you need to question that you've got the right moral perspective, that you've got the right ethical view on things. There's a lot happening in ethics because of AI and the IoT thing. The Department of Science, Technology and Business here is working on principles for the application of AI. So it's the problem. One of the big problems for boards, and this is not my idea, it came from one of the great academic legal minds in this country, Dan Hunter, who was saying boards are going to have a real problem because they're going to be asked to sign off on things where you've got machines making decisions.
Yes.
And how do you do that?
Yes.
So there will be different layers of support. People like you will call you in and say, what's your opinion? How do you translate this? But at the end of the day, they are individually and collectively responsible for the decision they make, even if they don't agree with it. So they need to make sure that they know what they're in for. I think that fewer people want to be on boards now. The AICD is probably doing a whole lot more training. I see that they're in transition, and they're a partner of ASA, and I think it's the most successful corporate governance institution in the world with 45,000 members. They're really good at what they do. But I do see transition. I mean, for example, but it happens all over. They'll talk about you've got to do IP this, you've got to know what are the protections in terms of the regulatory framework for boards. And then they say, and there's data. Now, to me, that is just nonsense. You don't have data sitting separately from corporations law or anything else. We've had electronic law for 20 years. It's all one thing. If you've got information systems is one thing. And boards need to understand that, and they have a right to go externally to get information, and if they don't know what they're doing, they should resign.
So,
Well, Yes, absolutely. I was just going to touch on it and say I'm a bit vexed about the issue of regulation. I'm not sure more regulation will get us to a state where we need to be. I think it's more about behaviour change. It's more about creating an environment that naturally leads to things like security by design, safety by design, rather than coming in with heavy-handed laws and regulations. I mean, like Helaine said, there's a pretty good existing legal framework out there at the moment, and I think there's a pretty good existing regulatory framework at the moment. It's a very Australian thing. That was a very nice way to put it, of over-prescribing all of these regulations. And you mentioned APRA's CPS 234. It's a very dense document. It's only about 11 or 12 pages, but there's so much in there once you start to unpack it. And there's a cost to that type of implementation that governments certainly don't bear, but businesses, and then by its very nature, consumers will bear that cost. So we need to have I think, more of a debate about whether increasing regulation will get us to that state where we want to be. I'm not convinced that it will.
I've actually got a view on the level of fines for the Privacy Act changes that required mandatory data breach notification. I personally don't think the fines are big enough because, if I understand correctly, no Australian business has yet been fined, even though
Correct.
there's been over 300 data breaches since that law was changed. And the reason for that view is that, you know, fines will, if they're not big enough, then it's just a cost of doing business. And we've seen this over in Europe with GDPR, which has much more significant fines. And we're starting to see fines in the hundreds of millions for big breaches over there. And I was interviewing an expert from the UK on the podcast last week, and he kind of said, we're now starting to see these fines, that they're big enough here in Europe that it isn't a cost of doing business anymore. And he feels that will drive up the standards of cybersecurity within businesses. So that's just a view.
The point on that,
Yeah,
they are looking at increasing the fine under our Privacy Act to 10 million, from 2 and a bit to 10. And I think what people underestimate here too is that there is massive extraterritorial reach under Article 3 of the GDPR into Australia. It goes far wider than most people think. So many of the businesses here are subject to the possibility of that 4% of global turnover. And in fact, I mean, I've got clients who operate Australia, China, UK, Germany. They're all over. So you need to know what laws apply to you before you can assess what the risk is.
Talking IoT, the Internet of Things, it's moved from being a buzzword to an actual thing where there are sensors everywhere, especially with the advent of 5G coming around, kind of tracking everything and collecting data on everything we do. How does that change how we talk about this, just given the sheer amount of data is just growing so exponentially?
I guess I see IoT as being just an increased vector for cyber criminals to use. So it's more that businesses have to be aware that the reach of their business and what they have to be looking at from a cyber risk perspective has extended into IoT. There is, IoT by its nature is pretty data hungry. It thrives on being connected to the internet, and there are manufacturers that are providing IoT devices that are maybe not upgradable from a firmware perspective. So we just have to be wary of that. And in fact, quite recently, a very large security and networking vendor was fined for supplying IoT devices with vulnerabilities to a government, with a known vulnerability. So I think we could potentially see more regulation in that space. But yeah, it's obviously a changing area as well at the moment.
I don't want to sound too dystopian about it either, Dave, but I think it's going to be completely fantastic. I love it. I love the things it's going to allow us to do, but I think once again we're in that situation where we're playing catch up, because a lot of these devices, they've been rushed to market. There hasn't been that consideration about, well, how do we secure these at the design level? And now what we're trying to do is apply all these retroactive patches or security upgrades, I guess, and that will ensure that it's going to be interesting times in the IoT field. But I mean, just the tremendous possibilities that it's going to unleash is, I think, going to be completely fantastic. And you often hear a dystopian view at a cybersecurity panel, but I think we should acknowledge that it's going to do some great things as well.
Well, maybe just on that, Daniel, let's go full dystopian for a minute. What, in terms of what's at risk here, and because this is serious stuff we're talking about, obviously, and it is one thing to talk about the opportunities, but then got to talk about the risks as well. And is it, I've written stories about potential utilities going down, whole power systems. Is it, what sorts of things do you think about when you think about just what's at stake here, really, in terms of if we don't get it right?
I think at a top level, and this might be a bit philosophical for 8:30 in the morning, it's the erosion of self. And I think it's the erosion of what you mean as yourself as a person and what you are as a private person. There's going to be so much data and information out there about you at any given time. You have lost control. Many of us have lost control of our own narratives and our own data that sits out there. So I think that we will need to really think about what it means to be a person and a person living in a country like Australia at a really dystopian level. I think we will have to change and have to adapt.
Yeah, and I think from a technology perspective, just to add to the IoT discussion, and you mentioned power grids and things like that, we also have OT devices now becoming IP enabled, and I guess, maybe a power OT network that's never been connected to the internet is now connected to the internet. So, and we've had this happen with traffic lights over in Washington, DC, around the time of Trump's inauguration, where there was actually ransomware on traffic lights, and those were so OT devices. So as those become connected to the internet as well, it's just, for me, it's a bigger attack surface for cyber criminals that needs to be managed.
We're probably getting close to time. Are we here?
I
just want to make one point, because it relates to this. And, people have been talking for years about people, technology, people, process, and technology. I've been talking about what I call civilization, and it's exactly this. How do we want to live? I think we still have time to decide the kind of society we want to live in, although the reality is that the machines are becoming more and more superior as the days pass, and not in my lifetime, but in a span of lifetime, things will change very dramatically. I would like you all, if you have access to Netflix, to have a look at the film called The Great Hack. It tells the story of the Cambridge Analytica story through the eyes of two of the people who were involved. And it really is very alarming, because we've seen the monetization of data, but we're actually seeing now the weaponization of human beings. And that's really what we've got to fight back. It's exactly as you say. It is about us. And if we don't hold on to how we want to live and who we want to be, we're going to be in trouble. Because personal information is, I've said a long time, the most important kind of information there is. It is right up there with national security, because it is this access to good and evil. So every one of us is an individual guardian of the societies that we live in into the future.
I don't think we value that data.
Yeah. Most people don't. They don't see that PI is important. Yeah. So that's the message to begin with.
Maybe one more before we open it up to audience questions. I wanted to talk about education. We're seeing cybersecurity courses pop up. We're seeing some grads come through. What do you think in terms of, are we doing enough when it comes to just training and training enough people to really be able to tackle this issue?
Look, this is once again one of those vexing issues for me, because I would say there's a lot of, once again, noise out there about a cybersecurity skills shortage and a gap, and that you hear all these fantastic statistics. But I guess it's not just a matter of the amount of people, so the quantity. For me, it's the quality, and what are we teaching people in these degrees is the most important skills and knowledge to bring to our industry. And I'm not sure we've got that balance right yet. I'd be really keen to hear what the rest of the panel thinks. For me, when I'm looking at candidates or people to bring into the team, the most important thing I look at is a curiosity and an ability to adapt and learn. So curiosity and resilience, technical skills and an appreciation of technology and cybersecurity is absolutely fundamental, and no one's going to dispute that. But for me, curiosity and communication and resilience is really important, and I'm not sure we go about teaching that in a systematic way enough.
I'll answer it maybe in a slightly different way. We've got about 19,500 cybersecurity professionals in Australia today. I would like to see the focus on educating everybody outside of that about cybersecurity, not to become subject matter experts and to care with the passion that we probably do, but more around just having the understanding of the risks so they can make decisions and empowering everybody to have that. Because at the moment, you mentioned, it appears that we don't care enough about our data, and I have this debate with my husband a lot. He's of the opinion, it's already gone, I've already given it all away to Facebook, who cares? And I argue, actually, I believe that everybody has that human right to privacy, to control their own image and how their information's used. But I also feel like everybody has the right to be empowered with the knowledge to decide. You look at a privacy statement from a business today, and it's with all due respect, it's in a different language, and to be able to go in, you're just clicking accept. This site uses cookies, accept. I just want to get to the information. But I don't think we're empowered to understand what we're signing up for, and we need to drive a much more simplistic, consumable view of privacy, safety, and security, so everybody is empowered to make a decision themselves.
Good point.
Any thoughts on just education and whether that's a broad population?
A point. So since 2016, when I was appointed to the board of ASA, we inherited research that had been done at the time that spoke of the skill shortage. Frankly, I don't think there is one. I think it's just a mismatch of language. Certain people in powerful positions are promoting the idea of an auxiliary force of 25,000 by the 2025 or something, and I like that idea. I like that idea of having clever people in the country who can get on to help us, because, as Louisa was saying just now, it might begin with cyber, but it's going to have a physical effect on, dams, rivers, utilities, whatever. So we need to know what we're dealing with. But I know a lot of really great people who are struggling to find jobs in cybersecurity. So let's help that side of the game as well.
I'd love to throw open to audience questions now. So if anyone would like to ask one, we've got a couple of roving microphones going around. So plenty of opportunity to ask a question.
Hi, my name's Dina Scott and I work in the health sector, and interestingly enough, across the river we're having our National Health Informatics Conference, and there's a lot of discussion and excitement around AI, but there's also a lot of fear around data and the volume of data that we're dealing with at the moment. I would be very interested to hear each of the panel's opinion on, or what piece of advice I can take back to my colleagues across the river, because I'm very fearful of the future, because healthcare, as we all know, is behind the 8 ball when it comes to managing this kind of thing. And there's data going from silo to silo, but it's also going everywhere, and it's going everywhere unencrypted and unmanaged. And I don't think the general public actually know where their data is.
Yeah, hi Denise, thank you for the question. It's a really good thought. I guess the primary couple of takeaways for you guys is it's definitely not too late, but I think the time to start planning and thinking about an overall security architecture for that industry, and one that acknowledges the key tenets, I think, of patient safety and patient care, and also using the tremendous value of that data and the anonymous nature of that data, if you can, to solve a lot of the problems in the healthcare sector as well, I think is really important, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. But I think it's definitely not too late, but there's a lot of work to be done in that sector. There's no easy fix either, and I think, even though I may be sounding like I'm contradicting myself from no more regulation, there's going to have to be a look at whether the regulation that's there at the moment is sufficient and whether it's working. And I mean, the National Health e-record, I mentioned it earlier, is a prime example, because you might recall the government had to introduce additional legislation just so people would sign up. So just so there was a base level of comfort, people would say, okay, I'd like, and that's actually doing some really good things from a healthcare perspective, I might say. Help your clinicians and pharmacists and everyone who's involved there get you the best possible care. But there hasn't been the consumer education piece as well, and there hasn't been the practitioner education piece as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done just in the education space in that industry, but there's also a lot of work to be done in standards and applications, because the potential for harm is probably up there with the financial services industry, I would say, in the healthcare sector.
I think it's more so because people die. That's why we had, which one was the one in the UK? The
NHS?
Anyway, the NHS attacked because they were using outdated systems, and you literally, switch everything off, people die. It's easy for somebody to extract money if it's a question of life and death. That's why that sector's so critical.
Thanks for your question. Any more out there?
Hi, I was at an industry event yesterday and they were talking about deep learning as sort of the next phase in prevention in cybersecurity attacks and things like that. And I was interested in the panel's view on how deep learning can actually take us to the next level in terms of cybersecurity threat prevention.
Oh, I think it's, thank you for your question. I think it's a fantastic realm to look in. There's a couple of really good companies doing some really interesting work. And
define it as well, Daniel, just some people might not know.
Yeah, sure. So the way I understand it is it's the use of machines or AI to look at patterns, behaviours across networks and understand or get a heartbeat for those networks, and then to learn changes to those networks, and then the ability to communicate those changes to people that need to know. So it's about understanding and then applying, I guess, that knowledge in some useful way is how I see deep learning. And in this cybersecurity context, there's a couple of really good vendors out there that are doing some great work. And what that's about, I guess, is understanding a network and nearly using it like a human body uses an immune system, I guess, is the response. So your skin's very good at keeping things out of your body, but when things that do get in, colds, whatever it may be, flus, the body has an immune response. And I think that kind of deep learning in the cybersecurity realm, I mean, I read an interesting statistic the other day that some enterprise level businesses have something like 56 or 57 layers of protection before they get to their networks. And once you're in, there's nothing inside. So I think systems and deep learning is probably a really interesting future path for how we might respond to threats. Because the one thing about malware and threats and cyber criminals is these guys are often ahead of the game. It's a low risk, high reward industry, so why wouldn't you? And the malware and the attacks are always evolving. So moving it towards an immune system type response makes a lot of sense from my perspective.
Yeah, it would be great to see those technologies used, to your point, to also learn more about the cyber criminals. We know that from the moment they compromise credentials, there's actually a really short window now to where they're actually using those. So, if we could learn maybe what they do in that time and how we can shorten our response so we can get ahead of them, it would be great to see that technology used there.
I don't know too much about it, but I do remember being impressed that when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, he wanted to use what he called an epidemiological approach to cybersecurity, which is exactly that. It's about learning how things respond.
Any more questions? Yeah, we've got one out there.
I had one just regarding the anti-encryption law that was passed in 2018. Just want to see sort of, I guess, 6 or 9 months on, what the impacts have been with regards to cybersecurity community in Australia.
Do you mean the Telecommunications Assistance and Access?
Yeah, it was named that, but I mean, yeah.
Yes, TOLA. Yeah, it's a monster. It's a monster. Look, nobody really knows. There are all sorts of promises. It was under discussion for a long time. I sit on the Law and Technology Committee for the Law Institute here, and we are asked to review and respond to a lot of legislation. And there were submissions that had gone through there with real legal insight. The security community in ASA also submitted. There were, I want to say something in the order of 1,500 submissions in response to that. When the Liberals were pushing it through at the end of last year, we were all fighting and saying, no, no, no. And the tech companies as well, some really outstanding ones like Senatus were saying, you can't do this, you're going to damage Australian industry. But anyway, they pushed it through. We had been, ASA, had gone to Labor and said, you've got to stop this because it's very vague, it's very all-encompassing, it's very empowering to total surveillance. And Labor just rolled over, was the term used. They promised that they would review it. It's not really reviewed. I haven't followed up the latest thing, but Chloe, who I work with, is here, and you can chat to her afterwards. There is something on the government website about their interpretation of things, and I think it was Mike Burgess who says, we promise we won't make people building back doors, but that's really the issue. Where I'm working at the moment, I have a client, and we build into all of the security requirements for service providers, and you will not build in back doors, and you will not do this. Well, actually, there's a law that says maybe you do need to build in a back door. So possibly we need to know how to work with what we've got. But it's bad law. It's bad law.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in my mind, it's a realisation of just how far behind the government is in the regulatory space and how much... It's nearly like a panicked law, to be perfectly honest with you. And we saw something... You saw something very similar, and this may sound a little bit controversial, but you saw something very similar in the wake of the Christchurch attacks and the laws that the government rushed through with respect to punishment of social media companies, and you're seeing a very reactive lawmaking stance from the government, and that's not going to lead you to the outcomes that's good for any of us. It's not going to be good for the government and the investigation. It's not going to be good for us as a society either. So I think a lot more work needs to be done. We need to keep the pressure up as well on these things because it can be a bit set and forget. And we're 6 months, 9 months in, and as you say, we're kind of struggling to know what the impact has been.
Too many laws and no implementation of what it means. Yep. So law is just theory. What you need to do is turn it into something practical. And that's what's missing. That's really missing. But a point on all of this is the fact of the matter is that we are losing this battle between privacy. There actually isn't any because of the vast amounts of data. But if you have a look at, there's a Big Brother Watch case in the UK that went to the Court of Human Rights. And even the Danish court, and I think it was the Swedish court, and some other cases said surveillance trumps privacy because we've got to have it for safety. So that's happening in the background. People are not paying attention to it, but the lawmakers and the courts, even of human rights, are saying it's got to happen. So we need to push back, but we're definitely losing, and Tola is just another example of it. But companies are leaving Australia because of its impact.
Time for a couple more questions.
Yep. Hi, John with Wiselow. I was just wondering if I could get your perspective on the pending enactment of the Sovereign Internet Bill in Russia this November and its anticipated effect on the cybersecurity landscape and the potential precedent set for internet governance internationally.
I guess one of the things that, thank you for your question, I've been worried about for some time now, and pardon the phrase, is the balkanisation of the internet, but I think one of the great unifying factors of it is that it is truly global, that there has been really solid and robust governance put around the way the internet works to make it a global enterprise, but you are starting to see sovereign nations try and retract or pull out from it. So Russia's the prime example. There's other countries out there as well, and I think when you pull out one part, you weaken the system overall, and it's a really dangerous path to go down. And it's one I think that Australia, as that nice middle power, as Helaine was saying earlier in the function, we need to put the pressure on diplomatically to make sure that we don't see this fracturing of the internet, because all of the benefits about speed and convenience, all the things that we love to do online now, is definitely at risk when countries try and take back or sovereignise elements of a system.
But that's a battle lost. I've got an article, if anyone wants it, called The Splinternet. The Splinternet, and that's what it is. Since, way back in the 60s and 70s, when America gave the world the internet, America has dominated and American companies have grown massively wealthy. Some countries have had enough of that. Russia is one, China is one, Iran is another. And they're all designing their own internet. That's the fact of life. They want to make the money and they want to control their environment. We need to learn to deal with it.
Yeah.
Another withdrawal.
Time for another question? Yep.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I have a question for you. So, how big a threat of dark web to cybersecurity, and what measures can we counter? Criminals working on dark web, for instance.
I might dive in with a definition to start. So there's a lot of talk about the dark web, and it's one of those things that people talk about but probably don't really understand. So you have, and I like to look at it as a bit of an iceberg. So you have on top of the iceberg, the whole iceberg is the internet. On the top bit is this, what I call the surface internet. So that's everything like Google, Yahoo, everything that you do on a day-to-day basis. Underneath that, Aaron, is the deep web. So that's things that are accessible on the internet but maybe behind certain access controls, and there's a lot of information out there that's on the deep web. And then at the bottom of that iceberg is a really small part called the dark web, and what you need to access the dark web is a special technology, so it's often done through a Tor network, or you may need a Tor browser. And look, anyone can go on there and have a look. I'm not so worried about the dark web. I think it's often inflated and overstated. So the figures range from anywhere between 5 to 10% of the internet is actually the dark web. The deep web, that bit that's behind access controls, is more like 60 to 70% of what's online. But I mean, I'm not worried about it as a security concern. To me, it's just another marketplace for criminal activity, and that's existed for millennia and will continue to exist.
And the powers that be, the law enforcement authorities, are learning to go down and play there too. So that's what happens. They just go where the bad stuff's happening.
And I mean, if you've ever been on it, you'll just see it's a pretty bad version of eBay. They need to do some work on their customer interface and design. They lost me at that.
I had a look too, but I was quite scared, so I left pretty quickly.
I accessed it once, but I couldn't do it from my newsroom, so I had to go to a hotel room, and then it felt more appropriate. It was a bit seedy, doesn't it? We have time for one final question, I think. I've got one down here.
Hi, I was just wondering if I would like to take more control over my personal data and know where it is. And is there any guidelines or something out there, or a guide to how to approach when you've been asked for personal data, and how to make sure you can know where it goes without reading 50 million pages of terms and conditions of the Privacy Act, which I used to read things like that, but now I just find it's just too hard. And as you said, you want to get on to the next information. At least I consider it. My kids just click without even thinking, and that's scary.
You really do need to read the terms and conditions. I mean, they are horrifying. Some people actually write, and we keep it, we own it, we can do what we like with it, we sell it. Oh. The worst is, the first warning sign is if you see a privacy policy that says, we care about your privacy. Stop there, because they actually don't get it. People need to be honest. We use you because it helps us make money, and then you go about honestly saying how you go about that. If you want a quick answer, give it a shot. Phone the privacy officer. There's always a link or there should be, somebody who's responsible. I think the result will be that you'll find too often that that person doesn't actually know what's going on because it's often just a name. But it would be good to keep testing and inquiring. The reality is that we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because if you're in the game, you're in the game, and those are the rules. And it's very hard to start changing a perception. But I think if you look even at what has happened with Facebook, there is a general resistance or an awareness, if not a resistance around the world now, to say, hang on a second, you have got all that money and you own nothing except stuff about me. Mm-hmm. You are rich because of me and people like me. So we just need to keep backing away.
I'm just going to butt in really quickly before Louisa's probably got some great thoughts on this, but there was quite a famous case, and it could be one of those cyber urban myths, but there was a case in the UK of maybe in a software company that in their terms and conditions put, if you get this far on page 62, email this address and we'll send you £1,000, and it took 18 months before they received an email. Someone had made it to that stage of the term. So you never know, you might win a prize if you delve deep enough.
Yeah, maybe I can talk a little bit about the future on that one, because I do believe that businesses will start to see people opting out of their data being collected, and that's actually going to hurt businesses. And you know, as business leaders in the room, we have to think about that, because if our consumers don't trust that we keep their data secure and we do the right things with it, they will start voting with their feet. Now, whether they choose another provider, that's the extreme response, but they may well say, no, you can't have my data, you can't send me things. And that is actually going to harm those businesses, because data is everything. You know, we know it's the new oil. It has such high value to businesses in their interactions with customers and how they handle them and what they position to them. So, you know, we can start driving them to care more, in my opinion, by saying, no, you can't. I'm not going to share that with you until you show me what you're going to do with it.
Perfect. Well, yeah, that's all the time we have, unfortunately. If we could thank our panel, it was a fantastic discussion.